My name is Clara Vance, and at 33 years old, I stand as a woman forged in the fires of abandonment. I was only 3 years old when my mother knelt down, looked me in the eyes, and told me to stay put for just 1 minute. She never came back. Through the frosted glass doors of that Chicago mall, I watched my parents' car disappear into a blizzard, abandoning me like a piece of broken luggage they no longer wanted to carry. But a man named Silas Thorne saw a shivering child, not a burden. He took me in and raised me to be a warrior. 30 years later, Silas passed away, leaving me a secret fortune of $2.9 million. Suddenly, the monsters who threw me away developed a very convenient case of parental love. They hired a ruthless legal team, fabricated a story about their kidnapped daughter, and dragged me into a high-stakes legal battle to steal every cent. They sat at the plaintiff's table smirking and whispering about how they'd finally hit the jackpot at my expense. They thought I was still that helpless toddler. But their smiles vanished the moment their lead attorney stepped into the room, his face turning ghost white. He didn't see a paycheck. He saw his boss. He bowed his head and said the 5 words that changed everything. "Good morning, Judge Clara Vance." Stay right here, because what followed in that courtroom wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was the ultimate reckoning for a lifetime of betrayal. If you believe that blood doesn't make a family, but loyalty does, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community. You won't want to miss a single second of how I dismantled their lies. Now let's go back to where the nightmare began. Everything started not in this glamorous courtroom, but on a snow-white night in Chicago when I was 3. The city was buried under a relentless blizzard that turned the streetlights into hazy orange orbs, and the wind howled through the skyscrapers like a wounded animal. I remember the weight of my heavy wool coat, a size too big, and the way my small hand felt, swallowed by Linda Miller's tight, sweaty grip. We weren't there for Christmas shopping. The air between Garrett Miller and my mother was thick with a tension I couldn't name. They hurried me through the glass doors of the sprawling mall, past the towering evergreen tree and the frantic crowds of last-minute shoppers. I felt like a parcel being moved, not a daughter being protected. Garrett kept checking his watch, his eyes darting toward the exits while Linda's fingers dug into my shoulder. We stopped near a deserted bench by the East Wing entrance where the draft from the revolving doors made me shiver. Linda knelt down, her face a mask of practiced affection that didn't reach her cold, restless eyes. She smoothed my hair and told me to sit right there and wait for just 1 minute because she was going to get me a giant bowl of strawberry ice cream. I believed her. I sat on that cold wooden slat, swinging my legs, watching their retreating backs blend into the sea of winter coats. I waited for 10 minutes, then 20, while the mall music played cheerful carols that felt increasingly mocking. Through the massive glass windows, I saw our dented silver sedan idling near the curb. I saw Garrett behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, and Linda sliding into the passenger seat without a single glance back. The tires spun against the slush, and then they were gone. The realization didn't hit me as a scream, but as a hollow, freezing ache. I was a 3-year-old ghost in a world of strangers. The mall security guards were busy, and the shoppers were too focused on their own lives to notice a tiny girl staring at the snow. That was until a shadow fell over me. It wasn't the police or a frantic clerk. It was a man in a charcoal overcoat standing as still as a statue. Silas Thorne didn't pity me with watery eyes. He looked at me with a sharp, analytical intensity that felt like a shield. He didn't ask where my parents were. He seemed to already know. He knelt down, not with Linda's fake warmth, but with a grounded, unshakable presence. He took off his scarf, wrapped it around my trembling neck, and told me that from this moment on, I would never have to wait for anyone who didn't intend to return. His voice was like a low hum of a cello, calm and commanding. He didn't promise me ice cream. He promised me a future. As Silas led me out into the biting wind, he didn't look back at the mall, and neither did I. He was a stranger, a man the world would call a reclusive billionaire, but to a discarded 3-year-old, he was the first person who ever looked at me and saw something worth keeping. Silas Thorne not only saved me from freezing to death, he gave me a new life that my biological parents could never imagine. Growing up in the vast library-filled corridors of the Thorne estate wasn't the pampered fairy tale one might expect from a man of his immense wealth. It was a rigorous intellectual apprenticeship that spanned over 2 decades. While other children were given trivial toys and coddled with soft lies, Silas handed me complex historical case files and architectural blueprints, teaching me that the world was constructed on logic, leverage, and law rather than luck. He never attempted to bury the memory of that mall under a mountain of empty distractions. Instead, he treated my early trauma like a dull, rusted blade that desperately needed sharpening. Every evening we engaged in fierce, structured debates over dinner, where he challenged my evolving perspectives on justice and morality, forcing me to defend my arguments with clinical precision and emotional detachment. Silas recognized that the abandonment had left a jagged, bleeding hole in my heart, a recurring nightmare of a silver sedan disappearing into a Chicago blizzard. He didn't offer hollow platitudes or promise that time would eventually heal all wounds. Rather, he insisted that my scars were the very armor I would wear into the legal battles ahead. He taught me that the only way to ensure I would never be discarded or overlooked again was to become completely indispensable, to become a person whose presence commanded a room and whose mind was an impenetrable fortress. Driven by a quiet, burning rage, I threw myself into my education with a ferocity that intimidated my peers, seeing every high grade and academic honor as a sturdy brick in the wall I was building between myself and my fragile past. At Yale Law School, I was consistently the first person in the library and the last one to leave the hall, fueled by the haunting memory of a 3-year-old girl staring hopelessly at a closing mall door. Silas Thorne watched my progress from the sidelines, providing the vast resources I required, but never the easy answers, ensuring that every professional victory was entirely my own. I didn't just want to practice the law. I wanted to embody it, to be the final authority who decided what was fair in a world that had been cruelly unfair to me. My ascent through the legal ranks was meteoric, moving from a relentless prosecutor to a respected appellate lawyer before I finally reached the federal bench. By the time I reached 35, I was one of the youngest judges in the history of the circuit, a woman who looked at the courtroom with the same analytical intensity Silas had shown me on that frozen night in 1994. Every single morning when I put on that heavy black robe, I felt the immense weight of my journey from a discarded piece of luggage to a guardian of the United States Constitution. I had transformed into the warrior Silas envisioned, a woman who no longer scanned the horizon for a car to return, because I had built a kingdom where I was the only one holding the golden keys. My survival and subsequent success were the most sophisticated forms of revenge I could possibly imagine. My peace shattered the day Silas's heart stopped beating, leaving an unfillable void and a multi-million-dollar secret. Silas Thorne passed away in the absolute stillness of a Tuesday morning, his vast legacy resting in the thousands of leather-bound books he had studied and the formidable legal career he had helped me forge. The funeral was a somber, private affair attended only by the handful of individuals who truly understood the brilliant, complex man behind the reclusive billionaire persona. A week later, I found myself sitting in his mahogany-paneled study, facing his longtime legal executor for the formal reading of the will. I had never once inquired about his wealth during our decades together. Yet the numbers disclosed in that room were truly staggering: $2,900,000 held in liquid assets, diversified stocks, and specific educational trusts. Silas had meticulously arranged his affairs to ensure I would have the absolute financial autonomy required to uphold the law without ever being swayed by external pressures or political favors. However, He had always been a man who avoided the public eye, a trait that unfortunately did not extend to the prying eyes of the local press. A junior clerk at the probate court, likely seeking a quick payout for a personal debt, leaked the intricate details of the inheritance to a tabloid journalist. Within 48 hours, the Chicago Chronicle ran a sensational front-page feature titled, "The Reclusive Tycoon's Secret Heir Federal Judge Inherits Millions." The article was filled with speculative nonsense and even included a grainy, unauthorized photograph of me leaving the federal courthouse. This unwanted publicity acted as a glowing beacon for the very predators Silas had spent 30 years shielding me from. Miles away, in a cramped and cluttered apartment drowning in overdue bills and unpaid gambling debts, Garrett Miller and Linda Miller saw the digital headline. They hadn't spared a single thought for the daughter they dumped in 1994 for over 3 decades, but the sight of 7 figures appearing next to my name sparked a sudden perverse surge of parental interest. Garrett, his face weathered and gray from years of poor choices, spent hours scouring the internet for any scrap of information regarding Judge Clara Vance. Linda, equally cold and calculating, used public records and legal registries to trace my professional trajectory and personal residence, her eyes gleaming with the sickening prospect of a massive payday. They dissected my entire life through social media mentions from my colleagues and public legal directories, realizing with a mixture of shock and predatory greed that the toddler they had abandoned in a mall was now a wealthy pillar of the American justice system. To them, I wasn't a human being who had survived their cruelty. I was a winning lottery ticket that they felt entitled to cash. They began their quiet, systematic stalking, lurking in the digital shadows and planning a calculated, deceptive re-entry into my world. The peaceful, secure existence Silas had built for me was being systematically dismantled by the very people who had tried to destroy it 30 years ago. They didn't want a family or a daughter. They wanted every cent of that $2,900,000. Only 3 weeks after Silas's funeral, the people who threw me away appeared at my office with the fakest tears I had ever seen. Garrett Miller and Linda Miller didn't look like the monsters from my nightmares. They looked like 2 ordinary aging citizens who had dressed in their Sunday best to mask the greed rotting beneath their skin. Linda began sobbing the moment she crossed the threshold, her voice a high-practiced tremolo as she reached across my polished mahogany desk, attempting to seize my hands in a show of maternal desperation. She wailed about 30 years of sleepless nights and the unending search they had supposedly conducted across 3 states to find their lost little girl, claiming that they had never stopped praying for this exact moment of reunion. Garrett stood stiffly behind her, dabbing at his dry eyes with a handkerchief and muttering about the private investigators they had allegedly hired with money they didn't have. I sat perfectly still, my spine pressed against the cold leather of my judicial chair, watching them with the detached clinical observation Silas Thorne had hammered into my psyche. I didn't see parents. I saw 2 desperate grifters who had calculated that a federal judge would be too terrified of a public scandal to call their bluff. When I finally spoke, my voice was a sharp, frigid contrast to their theatrical grief, devoid of any warmth or the recognition they were fishing for. I told them quite clearly that I remembered the silver sedan idling by the curb, the specific lie about strawberry ice cream, and the chilling way they never once looked back through the mall windows as they drove away into the Chicago blizzard. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Linda's sobbing ceased as if a power switch had been flipped, her face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice while she pulled her hands back. Garrett's hunched, grieving posture straightened, his eyes narrowing with the same predatory glint I had seen in the tabloid headlines they were obsessively following. Before I could summon security to escort them from the federal building, the heavy oak door swung open again to admit a man I recognized with a jolt of professional loathing. Julian Sterling walked in with a smug, oily grin, clutching a thick manila folder that practically radiated legal threats and calculated sabotage. Julian was a high-stakes defense attorney whose career I had nearly dismantled years ago during a federal corruption sting, and he had clearly been waiting for a vulnerability to exploit ever since. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he slammed a formal civil complaint onto my desk, his eyes alight with the fire of a long-awaited vendetta. He informed me that the Millers were filing a massive lawsuit against the estate of Silas Thorne, alleging that he had effectively kidnapped me from that mall in 1994. The legal filing claimed that Silas had used his immense wealth and influence to manipulate a confused toddler and hide her from her rightful biological guardians for over 3 decades. They weren't just seeking a sentimental reconciliation. They were demanding the entirety of the inheritance as compensation for their stolen years and supposed emotional distress. Julian leaned over my desk, his voice a low, threatening hiss making it clear that if I didn't settle the matter quietly, he would drag Silas's reputation through the mud and incinerate my judicial career in a storm of manufactured controversy. The Millers stood behind their new champion, no longer pretending to cry, but smirking with the arrogant confidence of predators who believed they had finally trapped their prey in a corner. While Julian Sterling was busy building a fake case to take me down, a stranger contacted me through a personal email. The subject line read simply, "The truth about the Millers," which compelled me to agree to a meeting at a secluded rain-slicked diner near the industrial docks. Sitting in the furthest booth was Caleb Miller, a 26-year-old man whose presence sent an immediate visceral shock through my system. He possessed the same sharp features and guarded expression that I had cultivated over years of judicial practice. He was the biological brother I never knew I had. Caleb didn't waste time with pleasantries or hollow emotional appeals. Instead, he spoke with the frantic, exhausted honesty of someone who had lived under the shadow of Garrett Miller and Linda Miller's toxic choices for his entire life. He laid out the terrifying reality of their current situation, revealing that my biological parents were currently indebted to several high-interest predatory lenders to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Their addiction to illegal gambling and back-alley poker games had stripped away every shred of their dignity and left them living in a state of constant fear and desperation. According to Caleb, the moment the news broke about the inheritance I received from Silas Thorne, Garrett and Linda had viewed it as their final escape route. They had actively sought out Julian Sterling, knowing his personal vendetta against me made him the perfect accomplice for their extortion scheme. Caleb described late-night meetings where they practiced their grieving parent act, coached by Julian to ensure their testimony would appear credible in a civil court. However, the most pivotal part of our meeting occurred when Caleb reached into his rucksack and pulled out an old velvet-lined wooden box that Silas had secretly entrusted to a reliable third party years ago for safekeeping. Caleb explained that Silas Thorne had foreseen the possibility of the Millers resurfacing and had spent decades building a defensive dossier to protect my reputation. Inside the box was a collection of original handwritten letters from 1994, along with a high-definition audio recording that changed everything. The recording captured a clandestine meeting between Silas and my biological parents just weeks after I was taken in. In his calm, commanding voice, Silas had offered them a substantial financial settlement to sign away their parental rights and never contact me again, an offer that Linda and Garrett had accepted with sickening eagerness. They hadn't been victims of a kidnapping. They had been willing participants in a transaction effectively selling their daughter to the highest bidder to fund their nomadic lifestyle. Silas had hidden this evidence not to deceive me, but to ensure that if they ever dared to return with their lies, I would have the absolute proof of their treachery. Caleb looked at me with a mixture of shame and relief, stating that he couldn't let them destroy the only good thing that had ever come from their lineage. As I gripped the edge of that wooden box, the fear that had been simmering in my chest transformed into a cold, relentless resolve. The warrior Silas had trained was now armed with the one thing no amount of legal maneuvering from Julian Sterling could defeat: the undeniable recorded truth of my parents' betrayal. On the day of the trial, the air in the courtroom was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Julian Sterling paced the floor with the predatory grace of a shark, his expensive suit reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights as he began weaving a tapestry of monumental lies. He presented a series of paid witnesses, shady individuals from the Millers' past who gave coached, perjured testimony, claiming they had seen Silas Thorne lurking near the mall in 1994. These hired hands painted a picture of a sinister kidnapping, suggesting that my adoptive father had used his vast influence to snatch a child and erase her identity for his own eccentric purposes. Then came the centerpiece of their grand deception, as Linda Miller took the witness stand, her face a carefully constructed mask of maternal agony. She sobbed into a lace handkerchief, spinning a heartbreaking narrative about the lost decades of her life and the hollow ache in her chest that only the return of her daughter and the $2,900,000 could supposedly heal. Garrett Miller sat in the front row, nodding solemnly to reinforce the performance, while Julian looked at me with a smirk that practically screamed victory. However, I remained unmoved, my hands steady as I signaled my legal team to initiate our counteroffensive using the contents of the box Silas had preserved. The courtroom fell into a deafening silence when we projected a digitally restored security video from 1994, a piece of evidence Silas had recovered from the mall's defunct archives years ago. The grainy but undeniable footage showed the silver sedan pulling up to the curb, and Garrett Miller roughly ushering a small girl toward the entrance without a single glance back. The video captured the couple laughing as they drove away, their body language radiating relief rather than the frantic panic of parents who had lost a child. The murmurs in the gallery grew into a roar of indignation, but the final blow came when Caleb Miller stood up to testify against his own blood. With a voice that didn't waver, Caleb detailed the years of hearing Garrett and Linda joke about their lucky escape from the burden of parenthood and their current desperate plan to exploit my success to pay off their gambling debts. He spoke of the predatory nature of their reunion, confirmed by his own observations of their secret meetings with Julian Sterling to rehearse their lies. Julian's smug expression crumbled into a mask of pure panic as his entire case disintegrated under the weight of this overwhelming truth. I watched from the defense table not as a victim, but as the formidable Judge Silas Thorne had raised me to be, seeing the sheer terror in Linda's eyes as her tears dried instantly upon realizing the game was over. The recording Silas had kept wasn't just a legal shield. It was a voice from the grave that finally stripped away the Millers' disguises. They hadn't come for a daughter, and they certainly hadn't come for justice. They had come for a payday that they would now never receive. The courtroom, once a stage for their lies, had become the site of their ultimate exposure, proving that while biology gave me life, only Silas Thorne had given me the truth. My gavel struck one last time, not to demand money, but to close a dark chapter of my life forever. The presiding judge, a stern woman who valued the sanctity of the court above all else, did not hesitate to dismiss the frivolous lawsuit with prejudice, effectively barring Garrett Miller and Linda Miller from ever filing another claim against the estate. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to a heavy sense of justice as bailiffs moved in to surround the defense table. Based on the damning video evidence and the perjured testimonies orchestrated by their counsel, Garrett and Linda were arrested on the spot for felony perjury and attempted grand larceny by deception. I watched my face, a mask of judicial neutrality, as the handcuffs clicked shut around the wrists of the people who had abandoned me 3 decades ago. They didn't look like parents then. They looked like small defeated criminals, their faces pale with the realization that their gambling debts would now be paid in years of federal prison time rather than my inheritance. The fallout was equally devastating for Julian Sterling, whose predatory legal career came to a grinding halt that afternoon. The State Bar Association initiated an immediate emergency suspension of his license, citing his role in suborning perjury and his unethical conspiracy to extort a sitting federal judge. As the courtroom cleared, the silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. I took the $2,900,000, every cent of the wealth Silas Thorne had painstakingly built, and legally transferred it into a newly established non-profit organization. I named it the Silas Thorne Legacy Foundation, an institution dedicated specifically to providing legal protection, psychological counseling, and educational scholarships for children who have been abandoned or neglected by their biological families. This was the only way to truly honor the man who saw a shivering child on a mall bench and chose to give her the world. In the wake of the trial, I found myself standing on the courthouse steps with Caleb Miller, the only person from my biological bloodline who possessed an ounce of integrity. While I made it clear that I would never again look upon the faces of Garrett or Linda, I reached out a hand to Caleb, accepting him not as a ghost of my past, but as a brother for my future. We stood there together for a long time, watching the city breathe, knowing that the cycle of betrayal had finally been broken by the power of the truth. I realized then that while I had spent 30 years trying to outrun the shadow of that silver sedan, I had finally stepped into the light Silas had prepared for me. My life was no longer defined by the minute I was left behind, but by the decades of love I had been given and the legacy of protection I was now building for others. The weight of the secret was gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable purpose that would resonate far beyond the walls of any courtroom. I was no longer the abandoned girl. I was the architect of my own justice, and for the first time in my life, I was truly free.